We've always been fascinated by the concept of superhumans. Some of the most famous stories, TV shows, movies, and books have depicted the image of some ramped-up human who managed to achieve unusual powers. For some reason, we view ourselves as limited, weak beings constantly searching for an intellectual and physical upgrade. For centuries, many beliefs have practiced various spiritual rituals to achieve self-transcendence. But in the 1920s, someone took the fantasy of developing superhuman powers a bit too far. And that someone was none other than communist dictator Joseph Stalin. When other leaders focused mainly on creating stronger fighter jets, tanks, and submarines, Stalin came up with one of the weirdest ideas of all time. And that is to create what he believed would become the world's most powerful weapon. A red army made of humansies, half human, half chimpanzee super soldiers.
Я хочу нового непобедимого человека, нечувствительного к боли, стойкого и равнодушного к качеству пищи, которую он ест.
Stalin's quest for ape-men super soldiers didn't remain an idea. He acted on it. In the mid-1920s, when the Soviets were one of the most impoverished people in Europe, Stalin gave his most prominent Soviet biologist millions of rubles to experiment with crossing humans with apes. What happened with this strange experiment, and how close was Stalin to producing his Red Army of super warriors? The story starts in the late 1800s. Russia was in a very tough spot, a population boom that coincided with a series of unfortunate events. A series of tragic wars and multiple harsh growing seasons resulted in extreme food shortages across the Russian Empire, which ultimately led to the 1891 famine that took 400,000 Russian lives. A few years later, the Russo-Japanese War, followed by World War I, would weaken Russia even more, leading the way to the Russian Civil War. In 1923, the Civil War ended with Lenin's Red Army claiming victory and establishing the Soviet Union. Upon Lenin's death in 1924, Joseph Stalin would become the newly founded Soviet Union's leader. Stalin had a vision, and that is to transform the Soviet Union from a peasant society to a superpower. Heavily influenced by Lenin, Stalin set up his development plan on the full centralization and government control of the economy, which included the forced collectivization of Soviet agriculture. Whoever tried to stand against Stalin's orders would face one of two fates: death or exile. He ruled with terror with a totalitarian grip in order to eliminate anyone who might oppose him. With most farmers either dead or exiled, the government couldn't keep up with the labor required to farm the vast land taken away from its owners. Terrible management led to widespread famine across the Soviet Union. The famine didn't only affect civilians, it also immensely affected the Soviet military, which had already been weakened due to continuous wars over the years. Stalin wasn't the type who'd understand people's struggles. With pressure to rebuild the Red Army and shortages in the labor force for the fast-tracking industrialization, he was desperate for a faster solution. This is when the story takes a dark twist. In 1926, following Stalin's orders, the Politburo in Moscow passed a request to build a living war machine to the Academy of Sciences. Only the best scientists in the nation could take this mission. The Soviets had the perfect man for the job, Ilya Ivanov. Ivanov was born in Russia in 1870. He graduated from Kharkiv University in 1896 with the equivalent of a PhD in physiology. He later conducted research at the Pasteur Institute in Paris, which helped him earn a spot in the lab next to world-renowned Nobel Prize winner Ivan Pavlov. He learned Pavlov's surgical techniques in artificial insemination and purebred horses. He perfected the process, allowing him to become one of the first scientists to produce hybrids of domestic animals in their wild varieties. Ivanov was the first to produce a zorse by crossbreeding a zebra with a horse. Despite his newly found success in science, he had quite a serious problem. Ivanov was broke. Motivated and confident by his recent discoveries, he wanted to push things further. He proposed to the Soviet Academy of Sciences to allow him to use their resources to fund his future experiments. Knowing what he had in mind, the Soviet Academy quickly accepted his proposal. You see, Ivanov wanted to test many hypotheses suggested in the scientific literature at the time. His biggest scientific influence was German scientist Hans Friedenthal. who in 1900 analyzed blood cells between gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans, in which he demonstrated the similarities between the species. As a result, Friedenthal suggested that the anthropoid reproductive cells could be similar enough to create a hybrid between humans and apes. To Stalin, Ivanov's plans to experiment with Friedenthal's theories were music to his ears. In 1926, Stalin passed a request to the Soviet Academy of Science with the order to build a living war machine. Ivanov would then shift his focus from breeding horses to creating a part animal, part human super warrior. Stalin's Red Army wasn't getting any stronger anytime soon. Time was of the essence. The same year Stalin made his request, Ivanov received around $10,000 as funding, the equivalent to about $300,000 in today's money. And in March 1926, he was dispatched along with his son to French Guinea, West Africa, where the experiments would take place. Simultaneously, back in the USSR, a center was set up in Georgia, Stalin's birthplace, for the ape-human soldiers to be raised. Ivanov took Pasteur's Institute's facility in French Guinea as a base, recruited a few local hunters to hunt chimpanzees for him, and started experimenting. He would take sperm from local male volunteers and try to artificially inseminate female chimpanzees. He insisted on using male pygmies as volunteers because he believed they were the closest thing to apes, and using his sperm would jeopardize the success of the experiment. In the first month of testing, Ivanov tried to inseminate 3 chimp females. But no matter how hard he tried, the experiments would not work. With time and money running low, Ivanov would make the horrific decision to try to artificially inseminate local African women with chimpanzee sperm without their consent. Ivanov managed to have local French doctors involved in his plan and execute his experiment in a local hospital under the pretext of a medical examination. Luckily, just before he made the experiment, someone leaked the information to French Guinea's general governor, Paul Poet, who immediately shut down the experiment and demanded Ivanov to leave the French territory. Just like that, Stalin's plans for building a superhuman army have come to an end. Upon Ivanov's return to the Soviet Union, an investigation was held on how things went in French Guinea. Soon later, the word got out that he had attempted to inseminate African women with animal sperm. Immediately, the Soviet Academy of Sciences stripped Ivanov of all benefits and support. The Soviet scientific community didn't want anything to do with him anymore, as they considered his actions problematic for future scientific expeditions in Europe or Africa. Ivanov was now a disgrace. After numerous attempts to get more funding for his experiments without success, one of his enemies in the scientific community accused him of sabotage due to malfunctions in the equipment he used in his mission. On December 13, 1930, Ilya Ivanov was arrested by the secret police and convicted of creating a counter-revolutionary organization, another way to punish him for losing money and negatively affecting the reputation of Soviet scientists. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, which was later commuted to 5 years of exile in the Central Asian Republic of Kazakhstan in 1931, where he worked for the Kazakh Veterinary Zoology Institute until his death of a stroke in March 1932. For Stalin, this strange experiment wasn't just about creating powerful soldiers, but it was also an attempt to validate his philosophies on communism and evolution through technology. Today, we may look at this experiment and think how insane and absurd this was, until we start looking at what we're doing in science right now. Subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.